Zara had always lived a life of luxury, surrounded by silk curtains, golden chandeliers, and servants who obeyed her every command. But despite the wealth, her life was not her own. Ever since her father's death, her stepmother, Madame Nia, had ruled the household with an iron fist. Zara was nothing more than a pawn in her schemes, a tool to be used for financial gain. Madame Nia's greed knew no bounds, and she had long planned to marry Zara off to a wealthy nobleman, a man old enough to be her grandfather. Zara had heard whispers of the arrangement, but had hoped foolishly that fate would intervene. She had no love for the nobleman, a man with a cruel reputation and a belly full of wine. The thought of being his wife filled her with dread, but in her world, love was never a consideration. Marriage was a transaction, and Zara was nothing more than currency. But fate had a cruel sense of humor. On the eve of her engagement announcement, disaster struck. A scandal rocked their household, a business deal gone wrong, an unpaid debt, or perhaps a betrayal by one of Madame Nia's so-called allies. Whatever the cause, the result was devastating. The nobleman withdrew his proposal, unwilling to marry into a family tainted by disgrace. Madame Nia was furious. She had counted on this marriage to secure her own future, to maintain the wealth and power she had grown so fond of. Desperation led her to an unthinkable decision. If she could not marry Zara into nobility, she would at least rid herself of the burden. And so, without warning, Zara was forced into a different marriage, one that shattered every expectation she had ever known. Ayo was nothing like the nobleman who courted women in grand halls. He was a farmer, a man who toiled under the sun, his hands rough with labor. His life was simple, his home humble, and his wealth non-existent. When Zara was told she would marry him, she thought it was a cruel joke. But the papers were signed, the arrangements made. Her protests fell on deaf ears. The wedding was nothing like the one she had imagined. There were no grand feasts, no music, no lavish gowns. Instead, she stood in a small village, surrounded by people who barely knew her, binding herself to a man she despised. Ayo, for his part, was neither cruel nor unkind. He treated her with quiet respect, but that only made her anger burn hotter. As she rode to her new home, leaving behind everything she had ever known, Zara felt nothing but resentment. She had been betrayed, thrown away like something worthless. She had once been the daughter of a powerful family, destined for riches and comfort. Now, she was the wife of a poor man, trapped in a life she had never chosen. And no matter how kind Ayo was, she had no intention of accepting her fate. Zara stepped into Ayo's small hut, her heart sinking as she took in her new reality. The walls were made of mud bricks, the roof thatched with dried grass. There were no silk curtains, no marble floors, no servants waiting to attend to her every need. Instead, a single wooden bed stood against the wall, a small table beside it, and a fire pit in the center of the room. It smelled of earth and smoke, a sharp contrast to the floral perfumes she was used to. She turned to Ayo, expecting him to explain, to offer her some sort of reassurance that this was temporary. But he simply placed their bags down and began tending to the fire as if everything was normal. To him, this was home. To her, it was a prison. The first night was unbearable. The mattress was hard, the blanket thin, and the constant chirping of crickets outside made it impossible for her to sleep. She lay awake, furious and humiliated, cursing the fate that had brought her here. Morning came with more unpleasant surprises. Ayo woke up before dawn and went outside, leaving her alone in the cold hut. When he returned, he placed a bowl of porridge in front of her and gestured for her to eat. She wrinkled her nose at the plain, watery meal. Back home, breakfast had been a lavish spread of fruits, honeyed bread, and spiced tea. She pushed the bowl away. "I'm not hungry," she said, her voice laced with defiance. Ayo didn't argue. He simply took his own bowl and ate in silence. His calmness only made her angrier. She wanted him to react, to see her suffering, to understand that she did not belong here. But he merely carried on, as if her tantrums were nothing more than a passing storm. As the days passed, Zara refused to adjust. She did not lift a finger to help around the house. The idea of cooking, cleaning, or fetching water from the well was beneath her. She spent her time sitting outside, staring at the horizon, waiting for someone to come and take her back. The villagers whispered about her behind her back, their eyes filled with amusement and pity. "She won't last a week," they said. "The rich girl thinks she's too good for us. Ayo deserves better than a spoiled wife who won't even sweep the floor." Their words stung, but she refused to show it. She held her head high, believing that soon Madame Nia would realize her mistake and bring her home. Each night she wrote letters to her stepmother. Long, desperate letters, begging to be rescued. She described the horrible food, the unbearable living conditions, the shame of being married to a man who owned nothing. She promised to be obedient, to do whatever Madame Nia wanted, if only she could return. She sealed the letters and handed them to a passing merchant, hoping they would reach their destination. Then she waited. Days turned into weeks. No reply came. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Perhaps the letters had been lost. But as more time passed, the truth became undeniable. Madame Nia had abandoned her. Zara sat alone outside the hut, staring at the empty road, tears burning her eyes. She had been thrown away, discarded like something worthless. Inside, Ayo continued his work, never pushing her to accept her new life, never forcing her to do anything she did not want to do. He treated her with patience, with quiet kindness, as if he knew something she did not. But Zara was too consumed by her misery to notice. She was still clinging to the past, refusing to see that fate had already begun to change her path. At first, Zara remained determined to resist her new life. She still refused to do chores, barely spoke to Ayo, and avoided the villagers as much as possible. But despite her coldness, Ayo never showed anger or frustration. He worked tirelessly from dawn to dusk, tending to the fields, repairing the hut, and even bringing her food, though she often refused to eat. He never raised his voice, never complained, and never made her feel guilty for her choices. One evening, as she sat outside staring at the dusty road, she noticed Ayo return from the fields carrying a small sack of yams. Instead of taking them home, he stopped by an elderly woman's house and handed her half of what he had. The woman smiled gratefully, blessing him as she accepted the food. Zara watched in silence. The next day, she saw him helping a young boy mend a broken fishing net. Another time, he carried a heavy basket for a woman struggling with firewood. The villagers, who had once mocked Zara's helplessness, greeted Ayo warmly, their faces lighting up whenever he passed. Zara found herself puzzled by his kindness. In her world, no one gave anything without expecting something in return. Yet Ayo never asked for favors, never sought praise. He simply gave because he could. One night, a sudden downpour soaked the village, the cold wind howling through the trees. Ayo came home late, his clothes drenched, his body shivering. He barely managed to sit down before a violent cough overtook him. Zara watched from her corner of the room as he tried to suppress it, his face pale and exhausted. By morning, his condition had worsened. His usually strong frame was weak, his skin burning with fever. He still tried to get up, to fetch water and tend to the fields, but his body betrayed him. For the first time, he was unable to work. Zara stared at him, uncertain. No one had ever expected her to take care of anyone before. Servants had always done the work, and in her father's house, weakness was a sign of failure. But here, there were no servants. There was no one else to help him. For the first time since arriving, she took a step toward him. She hesitantly reached for a cloth, soaking it in water, before pressing it to his burning forehead. She made him drink in slow sips, feeding him what little food they had. She sat by his side as he slept, listening to his labored breathing, feeling something unfamiliar stir in her heart. Days passed, and she continued to care for him. She fetched water from the well, cooked a simple broth the way she had seen the village women do, and even cleaned the hut to make it more comfortable. The villagers, noticing the change, exchanged knowing glances, but said nothing. Ayos slowly regained his strength, and when he finally opened his eyes and saw her sitting beside him, a quiet smile touched his lips. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured, his voice weak but grateful. Zara looked away, unable to find the right words. She didn't know why she had done it, only that something inside her had shifted. For the first time since her marriage, she no longer felt like a prisoner. Something in Ayo's quiet resilience, in the village's kindness, in the way life carried on despite hardships, had started to chip away at the walls she had built around herself. She wasn't ready to accept this life just yet. But for the first time, she wasn't so sure she wanted to escape it either. The days passed, and though Zara still struggled to accept her new life, something inside her had begun to shift. She no longer resisted every moment in the village, and though she never admitted it aloud, she found herself watching Ayo more closely. His kindness, his patience, the way he carried his burdens without complaint, there was something different about him, something she couldn't quite understand. One afternoon, while Ayo was working in the fields, Zara remained in the hut, attempting to tidy up. It wasn't out of duty or obligation. She simply wanted something to do. As she moved an old wooden chest near the corner, the lid creaked open slightly, revealing a stack of aged parchment inside. Curious, she lifted the lid fully and pulled out a bundle of letters tied together with a faded red ribbon. The paper was yellowed with time, the ink slightly smudged. The handwriting was unfamiliar, neither Ayos nor any villagers. With hesitant fingers, she untied the ribbon and unfolded one of the letters. "My son, if you are reading this, then I have failed to return for you. Know that I never abandoned you by choice. Fate was cruel, and betrayal was swift. You are the rightful heir to the house of Ayo, but there are those who wish to see our family fall. I could not protect you then, but I pray that one day you will find your way back to the legacy that is rightfully yours." Zara's breath caught in her throat. She flipped through the letters, each one revealing more of the same story. Ayo was not just a simple farmer. He was the long-lost son of a nobleman, the heir to a fortune that had been stolen from him through treachery. His father had fought to reclaim what was his, but had failed, leaving Ayo with nothing but a name that had been buried in history. Her hands trembled as she placed the letters back in the chest. Everything she thought she knew about Ayo had just been shattered. He wasn't a poor man by fate. He had chosen this life. He had willingly turned away from the wealth and power that had once been his birthright. Why? Why would anyone choose a life of hardship when they had the chance to reclaim everything that had been stolen from them? The Ayo she had married, the man she had resented, pitied, and dismissed, was far more than she had ever imagined. That night, when Ayo returned, she found herself looking at him differently. She saw not just a farmer, but a man who had lived through betrayal and loss, who had chosen peace over vengeance. For the first time, she truly saw him, and for the first time, she realized she wanted to understand him. In the grand estate that had once been Zara's home, Madame Nia sat in her lavish parlour, sipping tea as she flipped through a stack of letters. Each one was written in Zara's familiar handwriting, filled with desperate pleas to return home. With a smirk, she tossed them into the fire, watching the paper curl and blacken in the flames. Zara's fate had been sealed the moment she was forced to marry Ayo. Madame Nia had ensured it. From the moment Zara's father died, Madame Nia had plotted to claim the family's wealth as her own. But as long as Zara remained unmarried, the girl was an obstacle, a rightful heir who could challenge her control. The nobleman she had originally chosen for Zara had only been a means to an end, a way to ensure she stayed powerless. But when the scandal struck and the nobleman withdrew his offer, Madame Nia had acted quickly. She had arranged Zara's marriage to Ayo, thinking it a perfect way to rid herself of her stepdaughter permanently. A poor farmer's wife had no power, no voice, no future. She had assumed that once Zara was sent away, she would give up, resigned to her fate. But the letters told a different story. Zara still hoped to return. Madame Nia couldn't allow that. As she poured herself another cup of tea, a shadow entered the room. Lord Bacco, a nobleman with a reputation for cunning and cruelty, strode inside, his sharp eyes filled with interest. He had come upon an interesting piece of information, one that had the potential to change everything. "I hear the farmer boy is not what he seems," he said smoothly, lowering himself into a chair across from Madame Nia. She raised an eyebrow, feigning indifference. "Oh," Lord Bacco smirked. "Ayo, the man your stepdaughter was forced to marry. He's not just a simple farmer. He is the son of Lord Adewale, the rightful heir to an estate far grander than this one." Madame Nia's grip tightened on her teacup. "If this is true," she said carefully, "why has he done nothing about it?" "That," Lord Bacco mused, "is the question. But if he lives, he remains a threat. And where there is a threat, there is opportunity." Madame Nia leaned forward. "What are you suggesting?" A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. "I will deal with Ayo. His land, his inheritance. It will belong to me soon enough. And in return, you will have no more worries about Zara returning to claim what is yours." A wicked understanding passed between them. The pieces were set. The game had begun, and neither Zara nor Ayo knew that danger was coming for them. The morning air was crisp as Zara walked through the village, carrying a small basket of fresh vegetables. It had been weeks since she had discovered the truth about Ayo's past, yet she had not confronted him about it. Instead, she found herself watching him more closely, seeing him not as a poor farmer, but as a man who had willingly chosen peace over power. Somewhere along the way, her resentment had faded. She no longer saw the village as a prison. The once hated chores had become second nature, fetching water from the well, helping prepare meals, even learning how to weave mats with the other women. The villagers, who had once whispered about her, now greeted her warmly. She no longer felt like an outsider. And Ayo, he had been patient with her from the beginning. His quiet strength, his kindness, his unwavering resolve had slowly melted the walls around her heart. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she found herself standing beside him outside their hut. The golden light bathed the village in a soft glow, and for the first time, Zara realized she had no desire to return to her old life. She turned to Ayo, her heart pounding. "I was wrong about you," she said softly. "I was wrong about everything." Ayo looked at her, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath. "I don't want to leave anymore. I don't want to spend my days waiting for a life that never truly belonged to me." Her voice wavered, but she met his gaze. "I want to stay with you." Ayo's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, she saw vulnerability in them. He took a step closer, gently taking her hand in his calloused fingers. "You don't have to say that," he murmured. "Not if you don't mean it." "I do," she whispered. "I think I—" Before she could finish, a scream pierced the air. The village erupted into chaos. Men on horseback rode through the narrow paths, torches in their hands, weapons drawn. The villagers scattered, running for cover as the attackers slashed through stalls, knocking over baskets of grain and setting huts ablaze. Zara's blood ran cold as she recognized the crest on the rider's armor, the emblem of Lord Bacco, the nobleman who had been rumored to crave power above all else. And then she realized. They weren't here for the village. They were here for Ayo. Ayo grabbed her hand and pulled her behind him just as a sword swung toward them. He ducked, shoving her aside as he grabbed a wooden staff from the ground, blocking the next attack with practiced ease. Zara scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding wildly. She could run. She should run. But something inside her refused. She wouldn't abandon Ayo. Not now. She grabbed a fallen torch, swinging it wildly at one of the attackers who lunged toward Ayo's back. The man recoiled as flames licked at his cloak, giving Ayo enough time to disarm him with a swift strike. The villagers, seeing Ayo fight back, began to rally. Men and women grabbed whatever they could: farming tools, rocks, anything to defend their home. Ayo moved like a warrior, his every step precise, his strikes calculated. He wasn't just a simple farmer. He was the son of a nobleman, a man who had once been destined to lead. Zara had never seen him like this before, but she wasn't afraid. She was in awe. Together they fought, side by side, protecting the home they had both come to love. By the time the last of the attackers fled, the village was battered but standing. The people cheered, embracing one another, relief washing over them like a wave. Zara turned to Ayo, breathless, her face streaked with dirt and sweat. She didn't hesitate this time. She threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. "I love you," she whispered against his chest. "I love you, Ayo." He held her just as fiercely, his voice thick with emotion. "And I love you, Zara." Amid the wreckage, amid the chaos, something had blossomed. Something real. The morning after the attack, the village was filled with both exhaustion and quiet triumph. The battle had left scars. Some homes were damaged, some people injured. But the village stood strong. Ayo, battered but resolute, stood at the heart of it all, surrounded by people who had fought for him, for their home, for the life they had built together. But there was still unfinished business. Zara watched as Ayo spoke with the village elders, his usual quiet humility still present. But there was something different about him now, something unshakable. She had always known there was strength in him, but now it was undeniable. He wasn't just a farmer, he was a leader, and it was time the world knew. That afternoon, with a small group of trusted villagers, Ayo and Zara set off for the capital. Lord Bako had sent men to kill him, and it was time to expose the truth. But there was another confrontation waiting, one that belonged to Zara alone. When Zara arrived at her former home, it felt both familiar and distant, as if it belonged to a different version of herself. The grand estate stood untouched, lavish as ever, a stark contrast to the simple warmth of the village she had come to love. Madame Nia, dressed in her usual finery, was lounging in the parlour when Zara entered. For the first time, Zara saw her stepmother not as an all-powerful force, but as a woman made of greed and desperation. Madame Nia's eyes widened in shock. "You?" "Surprised to see me," Zara said, stepping forward, her voice steady. "Did you think you could get rid of me forever?" Madame Nia's composure faltered for only a moment before she regained it. "You have no place here anymore, Zara. Your father's wealth was stolen by you," Zara interrupted, her eyes burning with anger. "You intercepted my letters. You sent me away, thinking I would suffer, thinking I would break. But you were wrong." Madame Nia scoffed. "And what will you do? Run back to that miserable life? You are nothing without this home. Without—" "This was never my home," Zara said, her voice firm. "And I am not nothing. I have more now than I ever had under this roof." Guards entered, followed by an official who had heard of the attack on Ayo. The truth had spread about Lord Bako's crimes, about Madame Nia's treachery. The evidence against them was undeniable. Madame Nia paled as she realized what was happening. She had lost. Depending on the severity of her crimes, she was either banished from the estate, imprisoned, or left to wallow in the wealth she had fought so hard to keep. Alone, despised, and powerless. Zara didn't stay to see her stepmother's fate unfold. She had no more time to waste on a woman consumed by greed. She had a future to return to. Ayo's choice. Meanwhile, Ayo stood before a council of nobles, presenting proof of his identity. His father's letters, the surviving records, and even a few old allies confirmed the truth. Ayo was the rightful heir of House Adewale. Lord Bako, exposed for his crimes, faced severe consequences. His power crumbled as quickly as it had risen, and justice was finally served. The council offered Ayo what was rightfully his: a title, wealth, lands. But Ayo only shook his head. "I do not want a life of nobility," he said. "That world was never meant for me. I have a home, people I love, and a future that I built with my own hands. But the wealth that was stolen from my family, I will use it to help others, to rebuild the village, to give my people a better life." The council, though surprised, could not deny his right to do so. And so, Ayo left that hall not as a nobleman, but as a man with a purpose. When Zara and Ayo returned to the village, they were greeted with cheers. The news had travelled fast. Lord Bako was defeated, Madame Nia was no longer a threat, and Ayo had reclaimed what was stolen from him. But the most important part was this: he had chosen to stay. With the wealth he had reclaimed, Ayo helped rebuild the village, stronger, safer, and filled with opportunity. Schools were built, trade flourished, and no family went hungry. Zara, once a girl who had thought only of riches and status, now worked alongside the villagers, her heart full. She had found something far greater than wealth, love, kindness, and a place where she truly belonged. One evening, as they stood together, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant hues, Ayo took her hand. "Are you happy?" he asked. She turned to him, smiling. "I have never been happier." And with that, their new life truly began. The sun cast a golden glow over the village as the celebrations began. The air was filled with laughter, music, and the scent of freshly prepared food. The people gathered in the open square, dressed in their best attire, excitement buzzing among them. The occasion was unlike any before. It was not just a wedding, but a true union of love and fate. Zara stood before a mirror in the small hut she and Ayo had called home, her heart pounding in her chest. She ran her fingers over the fabric of her simple yet elegant dress, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. This time, she was not being forced into marriage. This was her choice. She thought back to the girl she had been not long ago, privileged, spoiled, convinced that happiness was measured in gold and luxury. How foolish she had been. Everything she had once feared, the life she had tried to escape, had turned out to be her greatest blessing. A gentle knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see one of the village women smiling warmly. "It is time." Zara took a deep breath, smoothing her dress one last time before stepping outside. Ayo waited for her beneath a beautifully decorated arch made of woven branches and fresh flowers. He wore a traditional tunic, his posture relaxed yet proud. His dark eyes softened when they met hers, and at that moment, the world around them faded. The village elder stood between them, smiling as he began the ceremony. Unlike their first wedding, which had been nothing more than a transaction dictated by others, this was a celebration of choice, of love, of everything they had been through together. When it was time for them to speak, Zara took Ayo's hands in hers, her voice steady but full of emotion. "I once believed love was something given, something arranged, something controlled by others. But now, I know love is something chosen, and I choose you, Ayo, today and every day." Ayo squeezed her hands gently, his voice rich with emotion. "I have always seen you, Zara, not as the girl you once were, but as the woman you have become. Strong, kind, fearless, and I will stand by your side, not as your protector, but as your partner." The village cheered as they were declared husband and wife, and as they kissed, Zara felt a warmth unlike anything she had known before. This was not just a union of two souls, it was a promise, a new beginning. As the celebration carried on, Zara and Ayo danced under the stars, surrounded by the people who had become their family. She had never imagined she could be this happy, that a simple life could bring her more joy than any palace ever could. Days turned into weeks, and Zara and Ayo settled into their roles, not as rulers, but as leaders who worked alongside their people. Ayo used his reclaimed wealth to build a school for the village children, ensuring that the next generation would have knowledge and opportunity. Zara started programs for women, teaching them skills that allowed them to earn their own livelihood. Together, they transformed the village into a thriving community where no one was left behind. Zara found herself writing once more, but this time it was not a letter of desperation or escape. She sat by the window of their home, the moonlight casting a silver glow over the parchment as she wrote, "To the girl I used to be. You once believed your happiness lay in wealth, in a world of fine clothes and grand estates. You resented the life that was given to you, convinced that you had been cast aside, that you had been wronged. But you were wrong. Fate did not betray you, it saved you. It led you to a place where love is not measured in gold, but in kindness, where home is not made of stone and luxury, but of warmth and belonging, where power is not in the riches you own, but in the lives you touch. You once begged to escape, now you wouldn't leave for anything in the world. This is your happily ever after." She placed the letter into a small wooden box, sealing away the past with a quiet smile. She no longer needed to write to her stepmother, no longer sought her approval or her mercy. Madame Nia was nothing more than a shadow of another life, and Zara had no use for shadows. As she put the box away, Ayo stepped into the room, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What were you writing?" he asked softly, pressing a kiss to her temple. She turned to him, resting her head against his chest. "A farewell letter," she whispered, "to the girl I used to be." Ayo smiled, pulling her closer. "Then let's look forward to the future instead." And so, they did. Not in a castle, not in a palace, but in a home filled with love, surrounded by people who truly mattered. A life of kindness, a life of purpose, a life they had chosen, together,